According to Tom Gunn, in a motorcycle poem, the first in his early book of the same name, he said, the sense of movement, which is to say, the way movement, on the move being the title of the poem in question and the title of the book, the way movement makes, actively constructs sense, both as feeling and as meaning, is that, as the poem concludes, one is always nearer by not keeping still. One is always nearer by not keeping still. Kate reminds me about Ursula Le Guin, her poem, GPS, how for Le Guin there are two directions, out and back. From the still center of the compass rose, there are two places, home, away. I lack a map that shows me anywhere but those. But then, of course, there's also in between, the from one to the other, from home to away and away back, which nowadays, when one is speaking of any sort of distance, as often as not, is traversed in flight. For some people, the experience of flying from one place to the other can be a continuous nerve-jangling passage through hell, from packing through baggage claim. Others, and I am one, drift into an alpha wave stupor. Time slows to a crawl and experience to a null point. The entire excursion transpires in a state of suspension, a sort of attentional hibernation. And then there's Kate, for whom the experience of air transit clearly quickens a heightened attentiveness. Lucky her, lucky us. Time was that transit stretched out at a stately pace, a foot or maybe hoof at most wind. Velocity was hardly an issue. Things took as long as they took. But then in the late 1830s, as trains hove onto and across the scene, velocity came to be of the essence. In his latest book, Jeff Dyer, this is a book that'll be out in a few weeks, has been rhapsodizing regarding J.M.W. Turner and his iconic painting, Rain, Steam, Speed, the Great Western Railway from 1844. How, quote, according to one account, a passenger on a Great Western train saw a man she later realized had been Turner leap up from his seat and crane his neck out of the window to feel the tumultuous sense of speed. Whether or not that report is reliable, Dyer suggests, it vividly demonstrates the purpose of this painting, to convey not an impression, but a sensation of speed. Although we are seeing the train from outside as if we are watching it hurtle by, we share the experience of the people within it. If the painting has a documentary value, it is as in registering a change in the nature of perception, how our perception of time and space is being changed by speed. The annihilation of time and space was the phrase that people came to think of about the near simultaneous onslaught of trains and telegraph and chemical photography. Trains and telegraphs have to come simultaneously. The telegraph lines go along the train, which allows trains to be on schedule and so forth. And then all this stuff happens between 1835 and 1840. The world is completely transformed by those three inventions. And they all happen in those fast years. And then once photography was invented, we very quickly, or by 1895, we get to movies. And the first thing that the Lumiere brothers choose to show into public is a movie of a train coming into the station, a sight that so frightened the audience, as you can see down there, that they all fled from the theater because they thought it was going to come in. True story. Somewhere I'm not sure where, perhaps it's in Wolfgang Schivelbusch's quintessential book, The Railway Journey, or else in that other essential book, Rebecca Solnit's River of Shadows, which, if you've never read that, you have to write it down. You've got to get that. It's her book about the life and times of Edward Muybridge as the quintessential. The subtitle, I think, is the technological Wild West. Edward Muybridge in the technological Wild West. Anyway, somewhere I read how in the early days of train travel, so extreme was the relative acceleration of velocity compared to earlier modes of transportation that people in their letters described how their cheeks were pressed against their face, their backs against the wall. It was like, they describe it like, one of those centrifuges. The experience was just, they were going a full 50 miles an hour and it was, Then again, time was true. But trains, or more accurately, transcontinental train travel, put a stop to all that. In olden times, in every village, noon occurred at the precise moment the sun reached its solstice zenith over the village spire. But that in turn meant that clocks in towns a few dozen miles to the east or west of each other might be several minutes apart, which in turn didn't matter until you started to have east-west continental train travel. And you got things like this, which were to help you figure out what time it was on your train ride. Trains that stopped in 17 places between New York and Chicago had to have 17 clocks on board, keeping different times. And this was obviously a huge problem. Eventually, there was in 1880 a conference in Washington, D.C. It was actually 1884 was this conference in Washington, D.C. to set up international time zones. And by a vote of 43-1, this was the thing that was set up, with Greenwich being 0 degrees and everything being arranged on that basis. Any guesses as to who the one was that voted against it? Come on, obviously France. And France insisted on having 0 go through the observatory, which is, by the way, the picture of Man Ray's The Hour of the Observatory with the lips. They are over the observatory because Lee Miller has just left him and he is at 0 degrees. That's why that's called that. But in any case, is it any wonder that a genius born in 1879 and growing up in a world grappling with issues of simultaneity and the like, but when it's noon in Paris, what time is it in Ulm, might grow up a few dozen years later, in 1905, to postulate an entire theory of relativity in which trains themselves, as in lightning strikes our rail embankment in 2 places, A and B, far distant from each other, would prove the principal props in his thought experiments. And the very mass of matter would get formulated in terms of that ultimate velocity, the speed of all things, light. In 1895, this accident occurred in the Gare Montparnasse, the Gare de l'Est, if you want to call it the Gare de l'Est, in Paris. I assume that the engineer, the conductor, did not know that they were using Paris 0 degrees as opposed to London 0 degrees. That's probably what happened. In any case, is it any wonder that an artist born in 1898, just a few years later, would go on to make that painting in 1938, which is variously known as La Durée Poignardée, or I forget the other name, but poignardée is kind of time, punctured, or time, what's a better title for it in English? But anyway, again, this notion of time, which is the thing that everybody thinks about in terms of trains. The other thing that's quite fascinating, if you think back at Einstein, is that he does that in 1905. He's working on it between 1903 and 1905. And this is what the Wright brothers are doing between 1903 and 1905 at the very same time. With the sensation of velocity the sheer rattle and the noise of it, again being of the essence, from biplanes through propeller-driven mail couriers and fighter bombers and civilian passenger aircraft. All was Saint-Exupéry. Everybody talks about the rattle, the noise, and the sense of wind and the velocity. But with the coming of jet flight, for all intents and purposes in the late 40s and early 50s, as Roland Barthes noted in one of his monthly occasional Mythologies series. When you read the book Mythologie today, it's a compilation of things he did in the newspaper. Believe it or not, they were publishing those things in a weekly basis in a newspaper. Anyway, there came a crucial change. This is Barthes talking. What is immediately striking in The Jet Man, the title of the essay, as opposed to the earlier prop plane pilot, is the elimination of speed. For excessive speed turns into repose. The jet man, and presently his passengers as well, are defined by a koanesthesia, his word, not mine, koanesthesia, of motionlessness. At 2,000 kilometers an hour in level flight, no impression of speed whatsoever, a smooth, near silent hum, with stillness at its core. You know, even if you look at kindergartners talking about, and then the plane went like this, and then it went like that. It's all of it's not. It's the experience is one of slowness. So anyway, I asked Kate, "What's your backstory?" And she told me about how she was born in Santa Fe in 1979. Her mother was a dancer. Her father, I guess you could say, an artisanal blacksmith. Would that be a fair statement? Okay. And they traveled all over the Southwest, various things. And at one point, her father would regularly take her sister and her to Yuma, Arizona for the annual Yuma Art Symposium. In 1991, this is her talking now, photographer John Gossage presented at the Yuma Symposium. So she would have been about 12 years old at that point. Between something I saw in Gossage's work and the influence of my aunt, Julie Dean, who was a photographer and someone I was close to, I came back wanting to pursue the medium somehow. I was around 12 years old. For my 13th birthday, I was allowed to set up a dark room in the attic. That was in 1993. In passing, she mentions that she went to study eventually at San Francisco State and later at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke. She said she kept her dark room until sometime around 2011, 2012. Keep in mind that digital photography is coming online. Coincidentally, around the same time that I started photographing in airplanes and traveling regularly. I was living in Chicago. I was doing freelance architectural photography for firms around the Midwest and the East Coast. I was beginning to work on art documentary projects in Durham, North Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee. Are you okay? This is going pretty fast because, just say she traveled a lot. She was traveling all over. My family she was teaching in Mexico and Peru. My family was still in New Mexico, California, Tucson, Colorado, Maine. Friends were scattered around the United States, Europe, even in Brazil. These are some of the reasons I was flying so much, surely over 50 flights across the next several years. Inhabiting the strange limbo of airports and the loneliness of planes, I always found the window seat to be its own destination and something like a studio of constraints. Initially, I'd focus on the view from out the window, the land and the clouds and the horizonscapes down below. But increasingly, my attention began being drawn to the constantly changing play of light across the nearby wings and the engines. I was recently looking through some of my contact sheets from 1995, and I found this one, that one, which reminds me a great deal of the great Barry Lopez line. That's the late Barry Lopez. He died just a few months ago. the great Barry Lopez line from his essay Flight, to the effect that of a plane's 6 million individual parts, 3 million are rivets. As you can see, she's a fan of rivets too. Among those 1995 contacts, she also found this trill, which she showed me here, which is obviously of the same person, but it looks like people lined up on the train, which in retrospect reads like a row of passengers, one beside the next. She says, whereas before I'd loved looking at the effects of sun on wing, suddenly I discovered the more intimate advantages within the aircraft, bodies, hands, drapery. At that point, she paraphrased a passage from Olga Tokarczuk's recent, the Nobel Prize winner from a few years ago, the Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk's recent narrative collage, Flights. And she sent me the direct quote, which goes like that. He sat squeezed into his chair amidst 200 people in the oblong space of the plane, breathing the same air they were breathing. In fact, this is why he liked traveling so much. En route, people were forced to be together, physically, close to one another, as though the aim of travel were another traveler, as opposed to to getting near. The aim is another traveler. So there's all that, she continued, but also the way outside light gets reflected inside, with each body inside the plane's cabin becoming its own sun. Especially she says, in an epiphany she refers to as SFO to ORD, May 5th, 2012, which veritably blazed into being before her very eyes as she happened to be training her camera on the far side of the cabin. That vivid red blush on the far side of the plane as the woman over there moved around in her seat, out of the monotone monochrome, that sudden moment of color. Sort of like Bergot's vision in Proust, I suggested, as standing before Vermeer's view of Delft on loan somewhere in Paris, Proust's writer stand-in suddenly notices, quote, that little patch of yellow wall with a sloping roof, that little yellow patch, which veritably slays him. This is Proust now. That, by the way, is Proust. Meanwhile, Proust writes, he, Bergot, was not unconscious of the gravity of his condition. In a celestial pair of scales, there appeared to him weighing down one of the pans his own life, while the other contained the little yellow patch of wall. I shouldn't like to be a headline news of this exhibition for the evening papers, he said to himself, all the same, which alas he was destined to be, for no sooner had he thought that than he proceeded to slump down onto the circular divan and then the floor, the victim of a heart attack. He was dead. And that is Proust on his deathbed, actually. Kate responds to my association. I'm working my way through Proust right now for the first time in my life, and it's extraordinary. But I haven't yet reached that passage yet. It turns out she reached it the next day. She's nodding her head. You think I'm making this stuff up. But it's funny too, she said. It's in the volume called The Captive or The Prisoner. But it's funny too because over the years I've sometimes come to think of the organization of life within the plane's fuselage as sarcophagal, what did you say? I can't remember. How do you pronounce that? Like a sarcophagus. Yeah, yell it. How so? Well, she says, that association may went back to 2001, when the night of September 10th, I had boarded a red-eye flight from San Francisco to Newark. This was my first visit to New York, and I arrived that next morning, half an hour before the first plane struck the World Trade Center. Back at the airport, with a full tank of fuel and a cabin full of new passengers and staff, the aircraft we had flown in on became United Airlines Flight 93, the fourth hijacked plane that was eventually flown into the ground over Pennsylvania, which, as you can imagine, her voice trails off before resuming. But other times, that fuselage can get more feeling like a chrysalis than any sort of funerary structure, a stasis from which passengers will emerge subtly transformed on the far side. And then that confinement that feels close to both birth and death, let me tell you, the light is absolutely extraordinary. Okay, well, if you were here for the Helen Patkin, you know I take overflights of my own and just go on things. So I'm sorry, but we're going to go on one of those right now, okay? Before becoming a novelist, a little water for this one. Before becoming a novelist, and indeed one of our finest, Walker Percy had been trying to become a medical doctor, perhaps a pathologist. Only in 1942 he contracted TB from a body upon which he had been performing an autopsy and came close to dying. Across the several ensuing years of his fitful recovery, he literally became a puzzle to himself. After all, in a sense, he'd become the disease he had been studying. And that happenstance crisis sent him hurling right out of medicine and into philosophy, specifically into phenomenology and existentialism, and to the precursor of them both, Kierkegaard. Percy's passionate pursuit was an analysis, as it were, of the alienation they had come to feel had saturated the modern condition. The sense of being alienated from the vividness of being, lost instead in the deep boredom of the everyday mundane. Quote, "One tires of living in the country and moves to the city," Kierkegaard had written almost exactly a century earlier in his essay, The Rotation Method. One tires of one's native land and travels abroad. One is Europa müde, in other words, tired of Europe, and goes to America, and so on. Finally, one indulges in a sentimental hope of endless journeyings from one star to the next. End of quote. But none of it works. There's no reprieve from deep boredom because, in a certain sense, one is oneself deeply boring. One needs being shaken out of oneself, or rather to find not so much a new place as a new way of being. In 1956, 5 years before releasing his first novel, The Moviegoer, Percy published an essay called The Man on the Train, which is collected in this book, The Message in the Bottle. It was published in the Partisan Review, and it was about a daily commuter who had been taking the same 8:15 local on the New Haven line from his suburban home to his downtown job, the same train, the same job, past the same anonymized neighborhoods, back and forth for years and years on end. And Percy spends some time anatomizing the man's profound alienization. But then surmises Percy, what if one day the train simply broke down and ground to a stop? And while the train workers took to trying to repair the bollixed engine, our man just exited the train and took to walking about, actually visiting, quote, the yellow, exclamation mark, cottage with a certain lobular stain on the wall, exclamation mark, that our man had previously spent years racing past, oblivious, without thinking about it at all. And what if the person on the porch of that house suddenly called out to him and engaged him in a conversation? An exchange which would presently shake our man clear out of his profound alienation and to his very core. I was first told this story by my philosophy teacher at Santa Cruz, Maurice Natanson, the great phenomenologist. I used to always go to Maurice Nathanson's courses, even when I wasn't taking them, because he was the greatest storyteller. That's him over there. He would just tell the most incredible stories, and it was like sitting in a room, and it was like Donald Barthelme stories, you know, these great, just these completely loopy, wonderful, weird stories of weird kinds of existential moments and so forth, and the fundament falling out of people's lives. And I would just go and listen to them. It was just wonderful entertainment. Years later, when I arrived at the New Yorker, I spoke with my colleague Donald Barthelme, and I was having a conversation. Who was the most influential? Was it UNESCO? Was it Beckett? Who was the big influence on you? And he said, no, it's funny. It was this teacher of mine named Maureen Nathanson at the University of Houston, or at Rice, I think, in Houston. And the two of them had this brain meld. They can take it sounding exactly like each other. It's very funny. And that's Barthelme over there. But the thing that I had forgotten, or never really caught in the first place in that long ago lecture, and only just realized the other day as I was writing this text, was I had gone down to the bookcase and I'd gotten that book and I started reading it. And I came, and he was describing that the train, Percy says, the train breaks down somewhere, quote unquote, between New Rochelle and Mount Vernon. And there's only one town between New Rochelle and Mount Vernon, and that's Pelham, where I live, next to the train station. And I had this completely weird moment, and I looked at the tracks, and I had this fantasy that this guy was coming out of the train, and I was going to start talking to him, and it was this completely weird thing. For the sake of the story, yes. And there's definitely lobular stains all over the place, especially indoors. But anyway, but talk about a frisson. In the uncanny inversion, I can almost sense that fellow ambling down the embankment just across the way, and him calling out to me to pull me out of my own quotidian alienation. By the way, you can see it there. I don't know, but right there where it takes, the red line takes up, there's Mount Vernon East and Pelham and New Rochelle. That's me right there in Pelham. Anyway, so the crazy thing is that I tell this story to Kate, is that she immediately responds that it reminds her of a story of Julio Cortázar. Have you read his short story, she said, called The Continuity of Parks? And that, by the way, is a story. It's about 2 pages long, and you can find it online, called The Continuity of Parks. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's in the same collection as Blow Up, she says, which, as you can imagine, is a story of considerable import to us photographers. But in the Parks story, which is very short, there's a moment quite like your sense of that man on the train climbing out of Percy's essay and arriving on your very porch. Only it's somewhat more distressingly fraught, I'll say. Indeed it is. Talk about sarcophagal associations. But I hazard, it sounds like Cortázar, but I hazard, it sounds like that his short tale may share various other phenomenological implications as well with Percy, specifically to the experience of intersubjectivity, the way in which we ourselves only really come into the world as subjects by way of the existence of others. That if we were alone on Mars, and there wasn't parents around, and there had never been parents, we would never get a sense of our humanness. The way we get a sense of our humanness is the existence of others, and the others gaze upon us. And Kate said it exactly, because that Cortázar story also relates to something I've always felt about these airplane photographs of mine. That sense that the arm I'm looking at in front of me or behind me could be seen in the same way by that very same person sitting in front of me or behind me as they look at me. Reduced to limb, drapery, skin, and light, we resemble each other. We are repetitions of each other. We are each other's other. That's Kate. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here, and this is Kate's fault, I said, can you find me a picture of you in the window seat? She has been doing this for 12 years now. How long? 7 years. 12 to hear me tell you. She does not, she has everybody else she's photographing, and she's really in intel. Everybody can look at her, but she didn't give the camera to anybody so that they could take a picture of her. So we don't have that. This is the only picture she has of herself next to a plane. So that's a stand-in until I hope you get this settled soon, okay? But this is when she was chartering flights. When you were chartering flights, it wasn't nearly as interesting as the commercial flights, she says. But did she take a picture of herself? No. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make, I've been trying to make before I was so delightfully interrupted, that wasn't you, that was me interrupting myself, is that our Kate on the plane, if you will allow, is exactly in all sorts of ways the very opposite of Percy's man on the train. For one thing, it's not as though she could ever just walk out of the stalled plane in order to re-engage with the world. On the contrary, over the past decade or so, she has been rushing to board every single plane precisely so as to seize the window seat from which to re-engage the vividness of lived experience. All the while, as she says, finding stability and some kind of constancy amid these myriad various jobs and experiences in that small space on the airplane between the window and the seat. Who would have thunk it? Can anything seem more ultimately boring, more alienating than the small sliver of space between the window and the seat in yet another, between the window and the window seat in yet another commercial jet airliner? And yet, as Flaubert famously said, anything looked at long enough becomes interesting. Interesting in that sense of being a gerundial verb, connoting the active outward projection of interest. It's not so much the world does or doesn't interest you, rather you bestow interest upon the world. You are interesting the world. Flaubert's, I suppose, being another way of urging, look at what bores you. And if look at what you've been allowed yourself to grow blind to become alienated from. And if you see something, certainly if you are an artist, say something. Since, as Eudora Welty often insisted, making the real real is art's responsibility. Making the real real is art's responsibility. Say something or show or prize. Since if you're a photographer, you prize it in both senses. You value it and you seize it. And you do so at the last possible moment. For as Cézanne insisted, you have to hurry if you're going to see. Everything is fast disappearing. And on the evidence of this metaphysics series, Kate Joyce's is an exceptionally layered act of seizing, a many-splendored gaze. There is, for starters, the liminal, a celebration, a cerebration of thresholds, and in several senses. A temporal threshold in that with several of these images, it takes time for the image to emerge. Photographic images were long famous for the way they only gradually and ever so hauntingly emerge from their various chemical baths in the darkroom. With many of the images in this series, even though they were all digitally prized and there was no longer any darkroom involved, it's as if they are still emerging, fixed though they are on the wall or the page. It takes us time to make out, or for them to make their way to us, to make them out, or for them to make their way to us across that threshold. These sorts of images. I mean, what the hell is that? And if you hadn't been hearing me all this time, what are those? but liminal as well in the sense of the architectural space along that inner wall, the inner skin of the plane's fuselage. Moving one's gaze from outside the window, these are some of her photographs as well, the sleek aerodynamic curves of the wings and the engines to the interior of the cabin. It takes a few moments to realize how the inner skin of the cabin partakes of the very same sorts of aerodynamic curves. The curve on the wing rhyming with the curve of the inner sleeve of the curve of the engine, and the same kind of feel and so forth. And indeed it has to. Back in the day, in the early 50s, some of the designers with the first commercial jet plane producers, notably the de Havilland Company, and their Comet passenger planes, endeavored to reassure passengers by rendering the interiors of their cabins as terrestrially familiar as possible. The windows, therefore, were straightforwardly rectangular, just like home. Nothing to worry about here. Everything's fine. But then planes mysteriously started falling catastrophically out of the sky. It took a while to figure out why. It turned out that the pressure variance between the inside and outside of the fuselage cabin and this became a problem during propeller planes. It was okay. That went up there. You can see the rectangles. It's okay. But once you start doing jet flight, which is in that one there, the pressure variance on either side becomes so extreme that the windows begin cracking and then exploding precisely at those rectangular corners. Back to the drawing board and to those smooth oval windows and their aerodynamically curved interior sleeves, evenly distributing the various pressures along the liminal passage from outside to inside. So there's the liminal, but then oh, by the way, that's a nice picture of hers. But then there's what I'd call the corneal, or if you like, the optical. Kate was telling me how as a child, one of her favorite books, which absorbed her attention for hours on end, was Lennart Nielsen's Behold Man book of photographs, and how one photo in particular had held her spellbound. Strange how that little sliver of space between the lateral edge of the window seat in front of you and the curved inner sleeve of that seat's window can itself come to seem like an opened or only just opening eye, alternatively staring in or out. And the way that the light pouring through across that Barthian stillness of regard. The critic James Elkins, incidentally, has a marvelous book called The Object Stares Back. Anyway, the way that look can in turn put you in mind, or did me, of other Vermeers, besides the View of Delft that we looked at. For example, this one. That way that Vermeer had of prizing images of women in the very act of having to stand still for some reason, because they were pouring milk, or testing a balance, or napping, or looking at themselves assessing a necklace in the mirror. As time itself coursed on, and the light poured in from the side window and across the back wall like a tide. Stillness as duration, almost a precursor of cinema. When I was talking about Helen, I talked about the way that Vermeer invented cinema. That if you look, because the woman is standing there like this, holding the balance, let's say, for several seconds. It's a moving picture in which her stillness is what's being portrayed, which is completely different if you look at some other old master's picture of a battle scene or whatever, and people are like that and so forth. But it's a cinema when you do the other. Anyway, moving on from that, we've had the liminal and the corneal, or the optical. We go to the corporeal. Some of her of Kate's pictures remind me of work by by a late New Mexico colleague of hers, Fred Hammersley, who was a great artist died in his late 80s, I think. I happen to have done the oral history of him when he was like 82. A wonderful person. But he did these things like this. Can you guys figure out what that is? Don't know. If you know, don't say. She's cheating. Do you know what that is? I'll give you a clue. That's another one from the same series. That's a woman sitting on a toilet and with her knee over and the reflection of the porcelain bowl, but this picture of Kate's reminds me very much of it. If you don't know, now that I've been talking, you have a sense that that's going to be some body part or something. But I haven't been doing that, I think you would have wondered, what the hell is that? And it's not just that, it's just others of her images as well. I absolutely adore this image here. The hair, and another one. And when I mentioned this to her, she, in passing, quoted Samuel Beckett talking about Proust, who said, "Curiosity is the hair of our habit, tending to stand on end." You could see how it certainly worked for him. Or for that matter, the folds of various enigmatically embodied fabrics. I'm pretty sure that's a pillow up there, I'm not sure. Which in turn remind me of how across her childhood, as Kate now tells me, she used to love gazing upon another set of images in that Leinart Nilsson collection. Images of fetuses wrapped in their placental folds. And that in turn reminded me of the way that the great 16th century anatomist Andreas Vesalius titled his massive foundational study of anatomy De Humani Corporis Fabrica. The fabric of the human body. That association in turn provoked another, as Kate recalled, a further favorite passage from Tokarczuk's Flights novel, in which the Polish Nobelist has her plane-bound character, Dr. Blau, drift into a waking dream about the monadology of fellow passengers ranged all about him. The monadology. How, quote, the surface of these monads hides within it vast mysteries, not even remotely hinting at the dazzling richness of these marvelously and cunningly packed structures. Not even the cleverest traveler would be able to compose the luggage in this way, distancing from one to another the organs for order, safety, and aesthetics, which peritoneal membranes lining space with fat tissue, cushioning them, and so forth. I botched that reading, but you get the idea. So went Blau's ardent ruminations through his unsound airplane half-sleep. Ardent ruminations indeed, which in turn brings us to the ideational layer, or perhaps we'll call it the cerebral layer of Joyce's metaphysical project, the sense of there being just on the other side, beyond the sliver-shaped looking glass, not just other bodies, but other minds, other intentionalities, just like ours, as reflected, for example, in the play of hands, the furthest extensions, if you think about it, of the thinking, gazing, musing, grasping mind. I've never understood why people think the mind is in the brain. It's obviously. We manipulate ideas because of how we use our hands. There's a great book on this by the philosopher Colin McGinn called Prehension, The Hand and the Emergence of Humanity. But there's also a great book by Alvin Noe called Out of Our Heads, which is, he says that mind, the reason you're never going to find mind in the brain, no matter how much you try, no matter how you catalog everything, is that mind isn't in brain, mind is outside. Mind is in the world. Mind is me looking at that light there and looking at her and playing with her. That's our inner subjectivity. Anyway, and so I have a bunch of these pictures of hands just to give you a sense of how, as a mind, you're looking at and imagining another person's mind playing things out. Which in turn brings us to the final and foundational, originary layer of Joyce's gaze across this body of work, the existential, the call to be where we are, even in an unattenuated and otherwise banal a place as this, the window seat of a transcontinental jetliner. At one point, Kate pointed me to a passage in the photographer Sylvia Platschi's 1990 memoir, Unguided Tour. The caption the photographer, a model and idol of Kate's, appended to the photo of a model and idol of hers, went like this. So in the book, there's a caption that runs along the vertical side of this picture. 10 nights before he died, master photographer Andrei Kertész, my friend, tripped and fell while walking back to bed after shutting off the hallway light. As he was 91 and had a fever, he didn't possess the strength to push himself up, and he fell into sleep on the floor of his apartment. He opened his eyes at dawn and thought, how strange, what lovely light, such interesting angles. Where am I? That passage, when she read it to me, immediately reminded me of a passage I myself composed a while back on the occasion of the opening of my own friend and mentor Robert Irwin's permanent site-conditioned installation at the Shinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas. The way I begin that article is, you wake up every morning. The California artist Robert Irwin would often begin talks he used to give, coming on 45 years ago now, to anyone, anywhere who would have him. He called himself available in response, and literally, if you invited him, he'd come and he'd talk your ear off. And he would say, you wake up every morning and a whole world is delivered instantaneously to your senses, and you hardly give the sheer marvel of that fact a thought. It's so taken for granted. The sights, sounds, textures, smells come flooding in, or rather maybe your awareness of, your attentiveness to the world floods out. And you just get up and go on with your day as if this were the simplest fact there could be, which of course it is not. Robert Irwin, that is, who used to forbid the photographing of his own works because he explained conventional photography could only capture what the work was not about and never what it was about. In other words, it could only capture image and never presence. Presence being, for him, an immensely loaded word. In some sense, is the very opposite of the immediate split-second present tense snap of an ordinary photograph. Rather, it was attention stretched across, awareness, stillness, and duration, which is to say, he's talking about being in time. Anyway, following a long description of Irwin's Marfa piece and its effect on me, I eventually concluded that piece as follows. Back home now, I wake up and find myself noticing the uncanny blush of dawn in the corner of my shade-darkened bedroom, and the rainbow-like arc of color reflected somehow off something out there, already decomposing, and then that sudden spear of light stabbing along the ceiling, slowly widening, and it's all of it, so heart-rendingly beautiful and so very, very present. A gift. Which is kind of how I find myself feeling about Kate Joyce's work in this project as well. A sequence not so much of images as presences. And yes, a gift many times over. Thomas Tranströmer, the great Swedish Nobel laureate. I used to always give lectures when I talk Thomas Tranströmer and said, "It's such a tragedy. He's Swedish because he's never going to get the Nobel Prize." And then he got it. Anyway, he has a wonderful poem called Sentry Duty, where he concludes, in Robert Bly's translation, task to be where by the way, Sentry Duty, I should say that's because he's a memory of when he was having to serve his 1 year of mandatory service in the Swedish, army guarding the borders from Norway or something. I don't know what he was doing, And the poem ends, task to be where I am, even in this solemn and absurd role, I am still the place where creation does a little work on itself. Toward the end of his life, Buckminster Fuller was asked whether, having done so much to make space travel possible, he was disappointed that he himself would never make it into outer space. "But, sir," he replied, ever so precisely, "we are in outer space." And here's a picture of Kate at home in outer space.